Now, India's External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar has concluded his trip to the United Nations General Assembly, and while speaking to a group of reporters after his address at the UNGA, the Indian External Affairs Minister said, and I quote him here, "There is no question that this UNGA reflects the state of the world, which is particularly polarized at this moment." He also added, what the state of the world actually reveals is that India matters more as things stand. The Jaishankar's statement is reflective of the role that India has been playing in three different arenas: the Russia-Ukraine war, the Indo-Pacific, and also its neighborhood, that is South Asia. When it comes to the Ukraine war, India's stance has remained very clear and very unambiguous since the beginning. India has repeatedly said that dialogue and diplomacy are the only way forward for a solution to this conflict. Now, India has in fact been calling for peace in the region.
As the Ukraine conflict continues to rage, we are often asked, whose side are we on? And our answer each time is straight and honest. India is on the side of peace and will remain firmly there. We are on the side that respects the UN Charter and its founding principles. We are on the side that calls for dialogue and diplomacy as the only way out. We are on the side of those struggling to make ends meet, even as they stare at the escalating costs of food, of fuel, and fertilizers. It is therefore in our collective interest to work constructively, both within the United Nations and outside, in finding an early resolution to this conflict.
While the West has gone all out in its offensive against Russia, India, remember, has refused to pick sides in this conflict. Now, New Delhi has maintained its historical ties with Moscow and at the same time has also strengthened its ties with the West. So even as the war rages on, India has managed to get exemptions from US sanctions for purchasing Russian weapons. It has also managed to import oil from Russia at a discount. India's balanced approach has helped secure its strategic interests. Now, the Western alliance, led by the United States, falls back on India for another key reason. It is a counter to China's growing hegemonic ambitions in Indo-Pacific. Now, India's ties with China have been frigid at best. Remember, the two nations have not enjoyed the best of relations since the Galwan standoff in June 2020. And also, there's this eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation that has taken place in the Ladakh region, resulting in the deadliest clash in over 45 years that ended with the death of 20 Indian soldiers. And since then, there have been several rounds of military talks. Now, China's relations with the United States have been at an all-time low after the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan on the 2nd of August, despite the Chinese protests. American President Joe Biden has vowed to defend Taipei from Beijing in case China decides to invade Taiwan. Now, India is, of course, seen as pivotal in containing China if tensions were to escalate. India is part of the Quad grouping, which includes the United States, Australia and Japan, besides India. Now, for the West, India is a natural leader of the Quad in the region. It has been deepening its defense ties with the Quad members. Another area where India is, of course, helping in counterbalancing China is in South Asia. In times of crisis, India has emerged as a friend to its neighbors. The case in point, of course, is what is happening with the Sri Lankan crisis. Now, the country has been facing its worst economic crisis since independence. The COVID pandemic and also economic mismanagement by its former rulers, the Rajapaksa brothers, has resulted in a situation where Sri Lanka simply hasn't got the money to purchase essential food items. It's also defaulted on foreign debt in the month of April this year. The Chinese debt has been partially blamed for Sri Lanka's economic woes. Beijing, interestingly, has offered only debt restructuring as a help to Sri Lanka instead of taking a cut in its outstanding borrowings. But India, on the other hand, has extended bilateral assistance and has offered $4 billion to Sri Lanka. Now, Bangladesh, which also has taken some Chinese loans, recently praised India's support. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has thanked India for its help during the COVID-19 pandemic, when India had provided vaccines to Bangladesh to help deal with the COVID-19 infections. Now, during the Bangladeshi Prime Minister's visit to India earlier in the month, she announced that she had sought India's help with food supplies and petroleum product supplies as well. Now, India has, of course, charted its own way when it comes to global politics. For its neighbors in crisis, it has been a friend, and when it comes to global issues, it has certainly played a balancing role. But most important of all, despite the many pulls and pressures in world politics, India has followed a policy of strategic autonomy. And also to give us more perspective in terms of how India's foreign policy has been shaped in these last few years, especially at a time when there are several crises that are raging around the world. We're being joined by Mr. Harsh Pant, who's joining us live from New Delhi. He's the head of ORF's Strategic Studies Program. Mr. Pant, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and speaking to us here on WION. Now, this statement by India's External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar, where he has said that India matters, especially in the aftermath of what is unfolding in the world. There's a war that is raging in Ukraine. There's also this belligerence on the part of China with respect to Taiwan. And in this case, what has happened is that India has been able to pursue its foreign policy independent of these world powers.
Yeah, I think this has been an extraordinary time in world politics and also, I think, for Indian foreign policy. And as we have seen over the last few days at the UN itself, and many senior leaders have come to the podium and given their remarks, India has been mentioned a few times. A few senior leaders like Emmanuel Macron and Biden, of course, President Biden have talked about India in the context of Ukraine. Some countries have talked about India in the context of COVID and the help that India provided. So I think India has been part of the wider global discourse at a time when polarization is actually at its height, and great power contestation is seemingly undercutting the global multilateral frameworks. And therefore, for India and India's role has always been a very constructive one, and one that tries to bring various blocs and various countries together. And as we have seen, India has been the voice for the global south, for some of the most vulnerable countries, one of the most underprivileged countries around the world, that are facing the brunt of this polarization of multiple crises. And that's, I think, when India speaks, therefore it speaks with a sense of authority, and therefore it is listened to.
I think that's a very valid point that you've said. Now, also, Mr. Pant, I want you to weigh in terms of how India has followed its policy of strategic autonomy, because in these very polarized times, especially at a time when there's this war that is raging on in Ukraine, the West has been leaning on its allies to try and ensure that the allies of the West distance themselves from Russia. But that has not actually happened in the case of India. Even though it is a part of the Quad grouping, India has continued to purchase oil from Russia. And not only that, the Indian Prime Minister, when he met with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, he told him that this is a time not of war, but rather of dialogue. And that actually, in many ways, makes India's standing much more elevated in terms of how diplomacy needs to be conducted.
Yes, I think India is one of the few countries that can actually talk to Mr. Putin on the one side and to the Western countries on the other, and make its point very, very clear to both sides that India is not going to work under pressure from the West in disregarding its ties with Russia, or in making sure that its channels of communication with Russia are open. But at the same time, India is also not going to stand back and say that, look, Russia is free to do what it wants. India has made it very clear that this is the time, as you were mentioning, the Prime Minister Modi himself telling the Russian president that this is not the time for war and conflict. This is the time to come to the negotiating table, because ultimately, who is suffering? Some of the most vulnerable countries in the world are suffering. Some of the poorest countries in the world are suffering. So I think in that context, what Ukraine war underscores for India, that India's commitment to certain normative principles is going to shape India's position, which also allows India to keep its strategic autonomy intact. So I think Dr. Jaishankar also in his speech at the UN General Assembly made it very clear that India stands on the side of those who believe in UN Charter, who believe in international law. And therefore, that aspect is very, very important at a time when major powers seem to be pursuing a policy of undercutting multilateralism and multipolarity.
I think you've summed it up really well there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harsh Pant, for joining us and getting us all those insights there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.